If you want a glimpse of where the world is heading, look to the youngest generation. And for our purposes, I'm going to call them Generation Z. You know, some of us are already familiar with Gen X, Gen Y, or Gen Z. In this context, I'm thinking about people that are about 20 years or younger. And the reason we need to pay attention to them, Melbourne should pay attention to them, is because about 15% of your 22 million people here in the country are under 20 years of age. But perhaps even more critically than that is the fact that out of a global population of 7 billion people, 2 billion are Gen Zers, or Gen Zers, as you might say. This generation is unique in many ways, in part because what they have in common is going to tie them together in ways that will transcend geography. In other words, what you might see is that a 16-year-old here in Melbourne might tell you they have more in common with a 16-year-old in Shanghai than either have with a countryman that's of an older generation. We know, of course, that they spend their time online. They are constantly connected. We actually have research that suggests that these people would tell you they would rather lose their wallets than their cell phone. And so this is their lifeline. We know that they're extremely social. About 50% of them participate on these different platforms, but it's not always about connecting with friends. It's become a major tool of productivity. You have 33% of this generation watching their classroom lessons online. They turn to their classmates or their peers also for help using these social media platforms. And commonly, those heavy book bags that many of us trekked around years ago have been lightened the load through virtual books that they carry with them. This will create the foundation of what work looks like for them. They'll be much more collaborative, they'll be more nimble, their work environments will tend to be a little bit more streamlined. But they're not going to want to work like the rest of us do. This generation really celebrates the rebels and the renegades, the people who do it differently. And while these trends certainly are driven or inspired in part by those who are 20 years or younger, they have global relevance to people of all ages. Now, the world has always celebrated the rebels, the renegades, the people who had a different way of doing things, the Steve Jobs of the world, the Henry Fords, maybe the Bill Gates. These people had a vision that kind of transcended the boundaries of what people thought their cohorts at the time thought were possible. But today, there are new platforms to enable rebels and renegades to be seen and heard. So things like Kickstarter platforms are possible, are giving people voice in a place that they never had. And so we have new heroes that are surprisingly young. You have one that's not so far from here. We have New Zealand's Lourdes, who at the young age of her late teens became a global sensation. And she was obviously a very gifted, talented performer, but her message was very unique to the extent that she asked society as a whole, maybe we need to rethink materialism, maybe we need to rethink how we define success. How do we find our way into the world? And this tone really resonated with people that shared her point of view or her experiences. So young people today, they really feel compelled to make the world a better place. And I'm talking specifically about people 35 and younger. So if you think about Gen Y, those people that are aged 21 to 35, and compare them to the ones who are under 20 years of age, this Gen Z, they feel even more strongly about making their way into the world, feeling that they have the ability, indeed, the responsibility to make an impact in making the world a better place. And some of them are going to do that through an entrepreneurial spirit. They're more likely to become business owners. Now think about the effects of the global recession and the way that it's changed work irrevocably. Those old models of employment where people would stay with the same company for 30 years plus are becoming rapidly a thing of the past. This generation has a strong entrepreneurial spirit, and so they're likely to try new things. In fact, they'll change their jobs 7 times between their 18th and 26th birthday. And they'll tell you it's not because they're trying to get more money, it's because they want to broaden their experiences. They want to take on new challenges. They want to meet new people. When you have that mindset, of course, the psyche is a little bit different. They are fearless when it comes to failure. In fact, that old thing about failure is a necessary evil, the next generation in the future, hopefully by 2026, no one will look at failure as evil at all. We recognize increasingly that it's just a component of innovation. And some people might even say that if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. We have the wisdom of Oprah Winfrey, who has said, there really is no such thing as failure. Failure is just life's way of showing you that maybe it's time to change directions. And so we do believe that people will have the ability to reinvent themselves. Identity will become increasingly fluid. You know, we talk about this youngest generation sometimes as the slash generation. These are the people who say, I'm a student, a photographer, a model, a designer. They dabble in lots of different things. You might even call it kind of the era of the dilettante, because they enjoy sampling and trying new things, putting on new hats. And so identity will become very complex going forward. Indeed, they will suffer many failures. We know right now 90% of all tech startups are going to fail. And that is a daunting number. Nevertheless, it hasn't stopped people from trying. We see increasing numbers of people that are starting their own organizations. And right here in Australia, you have some extraordinary success stories. So Vino Mofo, what a great name, has started and has been recognized by organizations around the world as one of the most successful startups. It has 300,000 members in which it serves discount wine services. We have Nimble, which is an organization that offers microloans. They have given us, they call themselves a fintech startup, and they've offered over 700,000 short-term loans ranging from $4 to $500 a piece. And then there's Airtasker. We're talking about the changing nature of work. Organizations like Airtasker will be the arbitrator that brings supply and demand together. This is a community of people that want to outsource their tasks, and they tap into this app so that they can find people that might help them with their services or post a job. Of course, when we think about the future, one thing that we'll have to deal with that's a daunting problem today and will probably still be with us 10 years from now is concerns about health and wellness. Did you know that for the first time in mankind's history, obesity has become a greater threat to our survival than malnutrition? In a global population of 7 billion, 1 billion people are obese or overweight. And sadly, you see this in part of the poorest countries of the world. You'll see starvation, the hidden hunger of malnutrition, and obesity existing side by side because the access to quality nutritional food is limited. And then we also see an influx of technology that's leading to a much more sedentary lifestyle. This is a global phenomenon. If you look at some of the numbers, you can see that it's rapidly on the rise, particularly here in the Asia Pacific area. In recent years, we've seen the age of population of the obese community rise rapidly in Vietnam, China, and India. Australia fares better than most, but still 1 in 4 of your children are at risk of obesity between now and the time that they reach adulthood. That's much better than what we see worldwide. Worldwide, we know that 50% of this generation will suffer from obesity. Obesity is the most rapidly growing in the youth segment. Harvard University did a study for 20 years, and they studied just infant obesity. This is the incidence of children under 12 months of age that have obesity, and the number went up 70% during that time period. And the reason this is such a cautionary tale is that no country has ever successfully turned the tide on these obesity numbers. Of course, it takes a great toll on the individuals, but as a society, it will be equally taxing as government has to figure out how do we tend the needs of the people that have additional health concerns. Wrap all of this up and imagine what these forces will look like inside of a diverse, culturally robust city like Melbourne. We know that city is going to become increasingly important in the next 10 years. In fact, McKinsey Global Institute has declared that in the coming decades, 60% of the world's gross domestic product will be generated by a mere 600 cities. And what's even more challenging about that number is that 100 of those cities haven't even been formed yet. So emerging markets will continue to play very prominently. For the established markets, we know that city life becomes more and more vibrant and is a very strong, compelling draw for young people. City residents in a city like Melbourne has seen a threefold increase. They're 3 times as likely to live in a city center because of the rich cultural options that are to the opportunities for work. But work will change. Even in Australia, we know that employment is increasing, and yet there are still widespread pockets of unemployment. This global race for talent is something that every country will deal with. As we think about how efficient technology has made our work, how much more productive and efficient we've become, we're left with the implications of a polarized supply and demand situation. Most employers will look for very high-skilled workers or very low-skilled workers, and many of us find ourselves somewhere in between. In recent years, countries like Europe have indicated that they've had something like 20% of the companies that they surveyed said they had senior leadership positions that went unfilled because they couldn't find the talent that they were seeking. That very same year, Japan had 50% of its companies say that they had jobs that they couldn't fulfill. And yet, this is against a backdrop of widespread unemployment. Figuring how to deal with this will be one of the biggest challenges in the next decade. And that's why so many people expect that they'll have the need to work overseas. The opportunities will become much more broad. These ideas where that you might have a TaskRabbit or these organizations that help match supply and demand will inevitably become more global. So imagine that you take on a job for 6 months somewhere in another part of the world and travel on sabbatical 3 months after that, then come home for a year to check on your home, and then you start the cycle all over again. Well, that might sound very daunting. It will certainly promote a different tone in terms of work-life balance, and that will lend itself to the health concerns that we have going on. City life will change also in other areas. We'll see congestion become a huge issue. Now, indeed, here in the city of Melbourne, you have a daily commute of about an hour a day, 30 minutes each way, and that's certainly uncomfortable, but it's nothing compared to what you might see in a megacity. A megacity is a city that has a population of 10 million people or more. The world has 20 plus megacities. Beijing, for instance, is one of them. And in a city like Beijing right now, the average daily commute is 5 hours a day. Imagine this, when they hosted the Summer Olympics several years ago, they had a traffic jam that lasted for 12 days long. It's almost incomprehensible, and they did the best to try to prepare for this shift by taking half the vehicles off the road through an odd and even driving paradigm. And yet these things still happen. And so moving people about will be one of the core functional responsibilities of any city to plan, because it will be a measure of how rich or the quality of life will be for its citizens. So we must explore new ways in terms of how we might move about. Cities are adopting more and more unconventional ways to move from point A to point B. And it's not just new ways, but there are multiple ways. The idea of multimodal transportation is becoming a global phenomenon. This is someone who drives their car to the local train station, takes the train on into the city, and then once into the city, maybe they rent a bike, they hail a cab, or they ride in a rickshaw. But this sort of dynamic will be changing because mobility will have to be accessible to all people. Now, mobility will be an ongoing challenge, but city planners are also rethinking the way that you might grow a city. Years ago, if you wanted to be a green citizen, you would move out to the country. You would live off the land. But nobody does that today. Sustainability experts recognize that the greenest way to live is quite vertical. And that's why we're going to see more and more megacities come about. But these megacities can be carefully planned. They will have a white space in terms of legacy and how they want to form their infrastructure, mass transportation, high-speed rails, new definitions of ownership, ride sharing, car sharing. We know that these things will change the nature of how people move, because ultimately, movement is the critical component that advances the freedom, the wellness, the innovation of all cities around the world. And with this, I hope these are the lessons that Melbourne takes forward when they think about how they want to shape the world, because it will be a collaborative process in coming up with a solution. And I hope to be part of that. Thank you.